The morning of September 12th began like any other day for Corporal James Aldrich. His alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, dragging him from a dreamless sleep into the cool darkness of his small London flat. 28 years old, with 6 years of military service behind him and 2 years as a Royal Guard, James had developed the kind of discipline that made early mornings feel less like punishment and more like routine. He moved through his morning ritual with practiced efficiency: shower, shave, breakfast of eggs and toast, then the careful process of donning his ceremonial uniform. The red tunic had to be perfect, every button polished to a mirror shine, every crease exactly where it should be. The bearskin hat sat heavy on his head, a weight he had long since grown accustomed to. James lived alone, a choice he had made after his engagement fell apart 18 months earlier. Sarah had been unable to accept the demands of his position, the long hours standing motionless, the inability to communicate during duty, the constant scrutiny from tourists and superiors alike. She had wanted a normal life, with normal schedules and normal conversations about normal things. James had wanted to serve something greater than himself. The relationship had ended quietly, without drama, just a mutual acknowledgement that they wanted different futures. Sometimes James missed having someone to come home to, but mostly he felt relief. The job was demanding enough without the added complexity of trying to explain why it mattered so much to someone who would never truly understand. The bus ride to Buckingham Palace took 40 minutes through streets still mostly empty in the pre-dawn hours. James used the time to mentally prepare for his shift, reviewing protocols and procedures, running through scenarios in his mind. This was not just ceremony. Behind the stoic facade and tourist-friendly appearance, Royal Guards were highly trained soldiers, responsible for the security of the palace and its occupants. They carried loaded weapons. They had the authority to detain, or even use lethal force if necessary. The general public saw statues in fancy uniforms. James and his fellow guards saw potential threats in every approaching tourist. Every unexpected movement, every deviation from normal patterns. The briefing at 6 o'clock was standard. Captain Elizabeth Morrison ran through the day's schedule with the efficiency of someone who had given this same briefing hundreds of times. The king was in residence, which meant heightened alert status. There would be a visiting delegation from France arriving at 2 in the afternoon. A charity event was scheduled for the evening in the staterooms. Increased tourist traffic was expected due to clear weather and school holidays. Nothing unusual, nothing that raised any particular concern. The guards were reminded to maintain discipline, to follow protocols exactly, to report anything suspicious immediately through their concealed communication devices. James took his position at the North Gate at precisely 7 o'clock. The gate was one of the less prominent entrances to the palace, used primarily by staff, official visitors, and service vehicles. It did not have the same foot traffic as the main gates where tourists gathered for photographs, but it required constant vigilance precisely because it was functional rather than ceremonial. People who entered through the North Gate had specific business at the palace. They were supposed to be there. That made it both easier and harder to identify threats. Easier because the pool of people was smaller and more controlled. Harder because anyone approaching had some legitimate reason to be approaching, which meant you had to look deeper, notice subtler signs of something being wrong. The morning passed slowly. James stood at attention, rifle held precisely, eyes forward, but awareness extending in all directions. Staff members arrived for their shifts, showing identification cards that James verified against the daily access list on his concealed tablet. Delivery vehicles came and went, each one inspected. Drivers checked against manifests, cargo examined. A maintenance crew arrived to repair some plumbing issue in the East Wing. 2 members of the palace administrative staff returned from an early morning meeting. A catering company delivered supplies for the evening's charity event. Everything checked out. Everything was routine. James's feet ached in his boots. His shoulders protested the weight of the rifle and the rigid posture. His face remained expressionless. Around 11:30. James noticed a black luxury sedan approaching the North Gate at a speed slightly faster than normal. Not racing, not suspicious on its surface, but just a fraction more urgent than the careful, respectful pace most vehicles adopted when approaching the palace. The car was expensive, probably German, with diplomatic plates. James's training kicked in automatically, his awareness sharpening, his body tensing imperceptibly beneath the uniform. The vehicle stopped at the security checkpoint 15 yards before the actual gate. James could see 2 people inside, a driver and a passenger in the back seat. The driver rolled down his window and spoke to the security officer at the checkpoint. James could not hear the conversation, but he watched body language, looking for anything that seemed off. The security officer checked something on his computer, made a phone call, then waved the vehicle through. The sedan rolled forward and stopped directly in front of James. The driver emerged first. A middle-aged man in a black suit, professional and unremarkable. He moved around the car to open the rear passenger door. The man who emerged was in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing an expensive charcoal suit with a burgundy tie. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to importance and deference. James recognized him immediately. Ambassador Philip Montague, the British ambassador to Belgium. A career diplomat with 30 years of service and a reputation for brilliant negotiation skills, James had seen his photograph during security briefings, had studied the faces of people with regular access to the palace. Montague was on the approved list. He was exactly the sort of person who would legitimately arrive at the North Gate, expecting to enter the palace. There was no reason whatsoever to question his presence, and yet something felt wrong. James could not identify what triggered his instinct. Montague looked exactly as he should. His identification, when he presented it, was genuine. The security officer at the checkpoint had already verified his appointment. He was expected at the palace for a meeting with the foreign secretary. Everything about this situation was correct and proper and completely legitimate. But James felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. His gut, trained through years of military service and countless hours of observation, was screaming that something was not right. Montague approached the gate with a pleasant smile. "Good morning, Corporal. Beautiful day, is it not?" His voice was cultured, friendly, exactly what you would expect from a senior diplomat. James did not respond, maintaining his ceremonial silence, but he studied Montague's face intently. The ambassador seemed perfectly at ease, but there was something in his eyes. A tightness, a strain, something that did not match the casual greeting and relaxed posture. James had learned to read people, to notice the tiny disconnects between what someone was saying and what their body was revealing. And Montague's body was telling a different story than his words. The driver had returned to the sedan, and was waiting patiently. Montague held up his identification card again, closer to James this time, as if assuming James had not seen it clearly the first time. "I have an appointment with the Foreign Secretary at noon. I believe I am already cleared for entry." It was phrased as a question, polite and deferential, but with an undercurrent of expectation. This was a man accustomed to doors opening for him, to his presence being welcomed and accommodated. James still did not move or speak. He was staring at Montague's hands now, and something about them was wrong. Montague's right hand was trembling, just slightly, barely noticeable, but definitely trembling. His left hand kept touching his jacket pocket, a nervous gesture that seemed unconscious. And there was sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning temperature. These were not the behaviors of a confident diplomat arriving for a routine meeting. These were the behaviors of someone under extreme stress, someone afraid, or someone preparing to do something terrible. James made his decision in that moment. He might be wrong. He might be about to create an international incident by refusing entry to a senior British official who had every right to be there. But every instinct he possessed was telling him that letting Montague through that gate would be a catastrophic mistake. James stepped forward, directly blocking Montague's path. He spoke for the first time, his voice firm and clear. "Sir, I need you to step back from the gate and wait here while I verify your credentials." Montague's pleasant expression flickered, surprise and something else flashing across his face before the diplomatic mask returned. "I do not understand. Corporal, my credentials have already been verified at the checkpoint. I have an appointment in less than 30 minutes. The Foreign Secretary does not appreciate being kept waiting." There was an edge to his voice now, irritation breaking through the polite veneer. James did not budge. "Sir, I am asking you to step back and wait for additional verification. This is a security protocol that I am required to follow." It was not actually a standard protocol for someone already cleared at the checkpoint. But Montague would not necessarily know that. James was buying time, trusting his gut, hoping desperately that he was not making the biggest mistake of his career. Montague's face hardened. "This is absurd. I am a British ambassador with proper clearance and an official appointment. You are creating an unnecessary delay and potentially jeopardizing important diplomatic discussions. I must insist that you let me pass immediately." James remained immovable. "I understand your frustration, sir. However, I cannot allow you to proceed until I have completed my verification process. Please step back and wait." His hand had moved fractionally closer to his rifle, a movement Montague definitely noticed. The ambassador's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching alarm. "Are you actually threatening me, Corporal? Do you have any idea what the consequences will be for this behavior? I will be filing an official complaint about this outrageous treatment the moment I am inside." But he was stepping back, his bravado not quite enough to overcome the reality of an armed guard, who clearly was not going to yield. James activated his concealed communication device with a subtle movement. "Control, this is Northgate. I have Ambassador Philip Montague requesting entry. Credentials appear valid, but I am requesting additional verification and immediate supervisory presence at my location." The response in his earpiece was immediate and confused. "Northgate, Ambassador Montague is on the approved list and already cleared at checkpoint. What is the nature of your concern?" James kept his eyes on Montague, who was now listening to this exchange with growing fury. "Behavioral anomalies. Control, request immediate response." There was a pause. Then Captain Morrison's voice came through, sharp and questioning. "Northgate, this is Morrison. Explain your behavioral anomalies." James chose his words carefully, aware that Montague could hear his side of the conversation. "Subject displays physical indicators inconsistent with stated purpose. requesting verification of appointment details and subject welfare check. Another pause. Then Morrison's voice, now very serious. Hold your position, Northgate. Response team deploying to your location. Do not allow subject to proceed or depart. Acknowledge. James felt relief flood through him. Acknowledged. Control. Holding position. Montague's face had gone pale. He looked from James to his car to the gate as if calculating whether he could simply make a run for it. But more guards were already visible, moving quickly toward the north gate from inside the palace grounds. The driver had emerged from the sedan again, looking confused and concerned. Within 90 seconds, James was no longer alone. 4 guards and Captain Morrison had arrived, along with 2 plainclothes security officers who James recognized as part of the palace's counter-terrorism unit. Captain Morrison approached with the measured calm of someone trained to handle crisis situations without revealing panic. Her eyes moved between James and Ambassador Montague, assessing the scene in seconds. Ambassador Montague, I apologize for any inconvenience. We have some routine security questions that have arisen. Would you mind stepping over here with my colleagues for a moment? Her tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for refusal. The 2 plainclothes officers positioned themselves on either side of Montague, close enough to intervene if necessary, but not overtly threatening. Montague looked trapped, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. This is completely unacceptable, Montague protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I have diplomatic immunity. You cannot detain me based on the paranoid suspicions of an overzealous guard. Morrison's expression did not change. We are not detaining you, Ambassador. We are simply requesting your cooperation with a brief security inquiry. I am sure we can clear this up quickly and have you on your way to your appointment. She gestured toward a small security office adjacent to the gate. If you would be so kind as to step inside, we can handle this matter privately and professionally. Montague hesitated, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. His right hand went to his jacket pocket again, that same unconscious gesture James had noticed earlier. One of the plainclothes officers noticed it too. Sir, I am going to need you to slowly remove your hand from your pocket and show me what you are reaching for. The officer's voice was still polite, but there was steel underneath. Montague froze. Sweat was running down his face now, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. It is nothing, just my phone. I was going to call my office to inform them of this delay. The officer stepped closer. Sir, please remove your hand very slowly and keep both hands visible. Montague complied, pulling his hand out of his pocket, but as he did so, something small and metallic fell to the ground with a soft clink. Everyone's eyes went to it immediately. It was a syringe, the kind used for injections, with a clear liquid visible inside. The atmosphere changed instantly, invisible lines of tension snapping taut. Morrison's hand went to her sidearm. The other guards shifted position, creating a tighter perimeter. Montague looked down at the syringe and then back up at the officers surrounding him, his face showing naked fear now. Ambassador Montague, you need to get on the ground right now with your hands behind your head, Morrison commanded, all pretense of polite inquiry gone. Do it now. Montague did not move, seemingly paralyzed by panic and indecision. You do not understand. They have my daughter. They said they would kill her if I did not do this. I had no choice. They have Rebecca. His voice broke on his daughter's name, tears streaming down his face. The officers moved in quickly, professionally, taking him to the ground and securing his hands with restraints while simultaneously calling for additional support and medical personnel. James stood at his post, still maintaining his ceremonial position even as chaos unfolded around him. His heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his system, but his training held. He had been right. Something had been wrong. That syringe could have contained anything from a sedative to a poison to a biological agent. If Montague had made it inside the palace, if he had reached whoever his target was, the consequences could have been catastrophic. James felt sick thinking about how close it had come, how easily he could have dismissed his instincts and let Montague pass. Morrison was on her radio, speaking rapidly to Palace Security Command and apparently to intelligence services as well. We have a potential assassination attempt at Northgate, subject in custody, weapon secured, claiming coercion and family kidnapping, initiating lockdown protocols and requesting immediate sweep of palace grounds and verification of all personnel currently on site. The palace behind James was transforming. Visible movement as additional guards took positions, as doors locked, as the machinery of security response activated with practiced efficiency. Medical personnel arrived and carefully collected the syringe using hazmat protocols, sealing it in a specialized container for analysis. Montague was still on the ground, crying, repeating over and over that he had no choice, that they had his daughter, that he was sorry. The plainclothes officers searched him thoroughly, finding his phone, wallet, keys, and nothing else suspicious. His driver had been separated and was being questioned by other security personnel. The sedan was being examined by a vehicle inspection team, checking for explosives or additional weapons or anything else that might pose a threat. Captain Morrison approached James, her expression unreadable. Corporal Aldridge, maintain your position until relieved. You will be required to give a full statement about what triggered your alert. You may have just saved lives today, but there will be an extensive investigation into this incident and your role in it." James nodded, understanding the subtext. He had been right, but he had also deviated from standard protocol. There would be questions about why he had stopped someone already cleared at the checkpoint, about what specific indicators had justified his actions, about whether he had followed proper procedures or simply gotten lucky. Within 20 minutes, James was relieved by another guard and escorted to a secure interview room inside the palace. He was given water and told to wait. The room was small and windowless, clearly designed for exactly this kind of security debriefing. James sat alone with his thoughts, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to identify exactly what had tipped him off. The trembling hand, the nervous touching of the pocket, the sweat, the disconnect between Montague's words and his body language. None of these things alone would have been enough to justify stopping him. Together, they had created a pattern that James's instincts had recognized as dangerous. After 45 minutes, two people entered the room. One was Captain Morrison. The other was a man in his 50s wearing a dark suit, his expression grave. Morrison made introductions. "Corporal Aldridge, this is Deputy Director Charles Ashford from MI5. He has some questions for you regarding this morning's incident." Ashford sat down across from James, pulling out a tablet and a small recording device. "Corporal, I need you to walk me through everything that happened from the moment you first noticed Ambassador Montague's vehicle. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Take your time and be as specific as possible." James recounted the events methodically, describing the approaching vehicle, his initial observations, the behavioral indicators that had concerned him, his decision to stop Montague, the discovery of the syringe. Ashford listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his tablet. When James finished, Ashford sat back and studied him for a long moment. "You realize that Ambassador Montague is one of our most distinguished diplomats. He has served this country for 3 decades. He has access to the highest levels of government. He was on approved entry lists. He had a confirmed appointment. By all standard protocols, there was no reason to stop him. Can you explain why you chose to trust your instinct over established procedures?" James met Ashford's gaze steadily. "Sir, I understand that my actions were outside standard protocol, but I have been trained to recognize threats, and Ambassador Montague was displaying multiple indicators of extreme stress and deception. I could not articulate a specific threat, but I knew something was wrong. Given that the palace was in residence and the potential consequences of a security breach, I made the decision to stop him pending additional verification. I accept full responsibility for that decision, and any consequences that follow from it." Ashford's expression softened slightly. "Corporal, you are not in trouble. In fact, you may well be a hero, though we will not know the full scope of what you prevented until we complete our analysis of that syringe and our investigation into who was behind this. What I need you to understand is that this situation is extremely sensitive. Ambassador Montague claims he was coerced through the kidnapping of his daughter. We are working to verify that claim and locate her if true. The substance in that syringe is currently being analyzed. We need to determine who the intended target was and who orchestrated this attack. None of this information can be shared with anyone outside of this investigation. Do you understand?" James nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand completely," Ashford continued. "We are also investigating how someone compromised a senior diplomat and got him past multiple security checkpoints with a weapon. This represents a significant intelligence failure that we need to understand and address. You will likely be questioned multiple times as this investigation proceeds. You may be asked to testify in legal proceedings. Your life is about to become considerably more complicated, but I want you to know that from where I sit, you did exactly what a guard is supposed to do. You saw something wrong, and you acted on it. That took courage and excellent judgment." Morrison added, "Corporal Aldridge will be temporarily reassigned to administrative duties pending the completion of the investigation. He will not return to gate duty until we have established exactly what happened and how our security protocols failed to detect this threat earlier." James felt a flash of disappointment. He understood the reasoning, but being pulled from active duty felt like a punishment, even though logically he knew it was standard procedure. Ashford seemed to read his expression. "This is not a disciplinary action, Corporal. This is about protecting you while we investigate potential security breaches. If someone was able to compromise Ambassador Montague, we need to ensure there are no other threats to palace personnel, including you." The interview continued for another hour, Ashford asking increasingly detailed questions about James's training, his previous experience, his observations of other people who had entered through the North Gate, his assessment of current security protocols. James answered everything honestly, aware that he was being evaluated as much as debriefed. Finally, Ashford closed his tablet and stood. "Thank you, Corporal. You have been very helpful. Captain Morrison will brief you on your temporary assignment. Remember, absolute discretion about everything that happened this morning. We will be in touch." After Ashford left, Morrison walked James through the next steps. He would spend the next few days in the security office reviewing video footage and helping identify any other potential anomalies in recent palace access. He would be available for additional interviews as needed. He would continue to receive his regular pay and would not be penalized in any way for his actions. Morrison paused before dismissing him. James, off the record, I want you to know that I think you made the right call. I have been doing this job for 15 years, and I have seen guards who follow protocol perfectly and miss real threats. You trusted your training and your instincts. That is what separates good guards from great ones. Whatever happens with this investigation, you should be proud of what you did today. James returned to his quarters, exhausted and overwhelmed. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him shaky and drained. He wanted to call someone, to talk through what had happened, but Ashford's warning about discretion prevented him from reaching out to friends or family. He sat alone in his small room, still wearing his ceremonial uniform, trying to process the reality that he had just prevented what appeared to be an assassination attempt on someone inside Buckingham Palace. He did not know who the target had been. He did not know what was in that syringe. He did not know if Montague's daughter was really in danger, or if that was just a cover story. He knew only that he had stopped something terrible from happening. The news broke that evening, though the details were carefully controlled. A brief statement from the palace press office announced that an individual had been detained at a palace gate for questioning regarding a security matter. No names were released. No details about weapons or assassination attempts were mentioned. The story was buried in the middle of news broadcasts, framed as a routine security incident that had been handled appropriately. James watched the coverage and marveled at how much was being left unsaid. How a morning that had felt like the most dramatic of his life was being presented to the public as barely worth mentioning. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Corporal Aldridge, this is Deputy Director Ashford. Preliminary analysis of the substance in the syringe indicates it was a neurotoxin. Extremely lethal. Death within minutes of injection. You prevented a murder today. Full briefing tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Well done. James read the message 3 times, his hands trembling. A neurotoxin. Someone had intended to kill someone in the palace using Ambassador Montague as an unwitting delivery system. If James had let him through, if he had trusted the protocols and ignored his instincts, someone would be dead right now. The weight of that realization settled over him like a physical burden. The briefing room at MI5 headquarters was nothing like James had imagined. He had expected something out of a spy movie, all technology and screens and dramatic lighting. Instead, it was a windowless conference room with bland beige walls, a long table, and uncomfortable chairs. Deputy Director Ashford was already there when James arrived, along with Captain Morrison and 3 other people James did not recognize. Ashford made introductions as James took his seat. Corporal Aldridge, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from our toxicology lab. Detective Inspector Michael Torres from the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Command, and Dr. Patricia Wells, our psychological profiler who has been working with Ambassador Montague. Ashford activated a screen on the wall, displaying a chemical structure diagram that meant nothing to James. The substance in that syringe was VX nerve agent, one of the most lethal chemical weapons ever developed. A single drop on the skin can kill within 15 minutes. An injection would have caused death within 2 to 3 minutes, with no possibility of survival, even with immediate medical intervention. Whoever gave this to Ambassador Montague intended absolute certainty of lethality. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression grave. VX is not something you can brew in your basement. This is military-grade chemical warfare agent. Whoever supplied this has access to extremely restricted materials and significant expertise. Detective Inspector Torres took over the presentation. We have been investigating how Ambassador Montague was compromised. 4 days ago, his daughter Rebecca was kidnapped from her apartment in Brussels, where she works for the European Parliament. The kidnappers contacted Montague within hours, providing proof of life and explicit instructions. He was to obtain the syringe from a dead drop location in London, carry it into Buckingham Palace, and inject a specific target during his scheduled meeting. If he complied, Rebecca would be released unharmed. If he refused or contacted authorities, she would be killed. James felt his stomach twist. Montague had not been a willing participant. He had been a desperate father trying to save his daughter. Has she been found? He asked quietly. Torres shook his head. We are still searching. The kidnappers used sophisticated operational security, multiple cutouts, encrypted communications that we are still trying to crack. We have Interpol, Belgian Federal Police, and multiple intelligence services working the case. But so far no solid leads on her location. The longer this goes on, the less likely it becomes that we will find her alive. Dr. Wells pulled up a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in his 60s. This was the intended target. Sir Geoffrey Hamilton, the King's private secretary, one of the most senior officials in the royal household. He has direct access to the King, manages his schedule, handles sensitive communications, and coordinates between the palace and government. His murder would have been not just a personal tragedy but a significant blow to palace operations and security. More importantly, It would have demonstrated that even the most protected individuals in Britain are vulnerable to assassination. Ashford continued. We are operating on the theory that this was not just about killing Hamilton. This was about sending a message. Someone wanted to prove they could compromise a senior diplomat, penetrate palace security, and execute a high-value target in one of the most secure locations in the country. The question is who and why. We have several working theories, but no definitive answers yet. He looked directly at James. Which brings us to why you are here. Corporal, you disrupted a very sophisticated operation. The people behind this invested significant resources, took enormous risks, and were hours away from success. You stopped them. That makes you both a hero and a potential target. James felt the temperature in the room drop. A target. You think they might come after me? Morrison answered, her voice steady but serious. We have to assume that possibility. These people are still out there. They still have Rebecca Montague, assuming she is alive. They failed in their primary objective because of your intervention. Depending on their psychological profile and operational objectives, they may decide that eliminating you or using you as leverage is worth the risk. We are implementing immediate protective measures for you and conducting threat assessments on all your known associates and family members. James thought about his parents, retired and living in Cornwall, his younger sister Emily, a teacher in Manchester, his former fiancée Sarah, who he had not spoken to in months but who could still theoretically be used against him. What kind of protective measures? Ashford pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Effective immediately. You are being moved to a secure location. Your family has already been notified and are being offered protective details, though they can decline if they choose. Your personal devices will be replaced with secure models. You will have a protection officer assigned to you at all times, and your duties at the palace are suspended indefinitely. James opened the folder, scanning documents that detailed a complete upheaval of his life. New address, new phone number, new identity for public interactions, protocols for communication with family, restrictions on movement and activities. For how long? He asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Torres replied, until we have arrested everyone involved in this operation and neutralized the threat. Could be weeks, could be months. We do not know yet. What we do know is that we cannot risk your safety or use you as a vulnerability point that could be exploited against palace security. The briefing continued for another 2 hours, covering operational details, communication protocols, what James could and could not tell his family, how to recognize potential surveillance or threats, what to do in various emergency scenarios. By the end, James felt overwhelmed and disconnected from reality. Yesterday morning he had been a royal guard following his normal routine. Now he was apparently a target for international assassins, being moved into protective custody, and facing an indefinite period of his life being controlled by security services. After the briefing, Morrison pulled him aside. James, I know this is a lot to process, but I need you to understand how serious this situation is. These people murdered before, they will likely murder again. They have demonstrated capability and willingness to attack high-value targets. You are now part of this, whether you want it to be or not. The protection we are offering is not optional. It is necessary. James nodded numbly. I understand, Captain. I will cooperate fully. Morrison's expression softened slightly. For what it is worth, you did the right thing. You saved Hamilton's life. You prevented a major security breach. You should be proud of that, even as you deal with the consequences. James was driven to his new temporary residence, a nondescript flat in an anonymous building in North London. 2 protection officers, both former military, introduced themselves as David and Marcus. They would be with him, in rotating shifts 24 hours a day, until the threat was resolved. The flat was clean and functional, but impersonal, the kind of place that felt like a hotel room rather than a home. James unpacked his few belongings, feeling displaced and rootless. His phone buzzed with a call from his mother. He answered, hearing her worried voice. James, darling. What is happening? 2 police officers came to the house and said something about security concerns. Are you in danger? James chose his words carefully, aware that the phone was likely being monitored. Ma'am, there was an incident at work. I cannot give you details, but the security services think it is best if I stay somewhere safe for a while. You and Dad are not in any danger, but they might have officers checking on you periodically. It is just a precaution. His mother was silent for a moment, and James could picture her face, the worry lines deepening around her eyes. This is about that news story, is it not? The security incident at the palace? You were involved in that, James hedged. I cannot really talk about it, ma'am, but I am fine. I am safe. I just need you to trust me and follow whatever the security people tell you. All right? The days that followed blurred together in monotonous routine. James was essentially confined to the flat, except for carefully controlled outings to debriefing sessions at MI5 headquarters. He spent hours being interviewed about every detail of the incident, about his training, about his observations. He reviewed security footage, identifying patterns and potential vulnerabilities. He worked with the profilers, helping them understand what had triggered his instincts that morning. The work was important, but it was also exhausting and isolating. David and Marcus were professional and friendly enough, but they were guards, not companions. James felt more like a prisoner than someone being protected. On the 5th day, Ashford visited the flat with significant news. We have made progress in the investigation. The syringe was traced back to a theft from a military research facility in Russia 3 years ago. The dead drop location where Montague retrieved it was under surveillance, and we have identified several individuals connected to a private military contractor called Volkov Solutions. They operate in gray areas, providing security services and other less legal activities to clients willing to pay premium rates. We believe someone hired them to carry out Hamilton's assassination, using Montague as the delivery mechanism. James sat forward, eager for any information that might help make sense of what was happening. Do you know who hired them? Ashford shook his head. Not yet. Volkov Solutions is very good at maintaining client confidentiality, but we have arrested 3 of their operatives in London, and we are working with Russian authorities to identify others. The problem is that this organization has cells across Europe and Asia. Taking down one operation does not necessarily neutralize the broader threat. We need to identify the client, understand their motive, and determine if they have other plans in motion. The breakthrough came on day 8. Detective Inspector Torres arrived at the flat with an urgency that immediately put James on alert. We found Rebecca Montague. She was being held in an abandoned warehouse outside Brussels. Belgian special forces raided the location an hour ago. She is alive, traumatized but physically unharmed. More importantly, we captured 2 of her kidnappers, and one of them is talking in exchange for a deal. We now know who ordered the hit on Hamilton. Torres pulled up a photo on his tablet, showing a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and cold eyes. Viktor Orlov, a Russian oligarch with ties to organized crime and rogue intelligence elements. He has been on multiple watch lists for years. Ashford, joining the conversation via secure video link, provided context. Orlov has significant financial holdings that Hamilton's department was investigating for money laundering and sanctions violations. If Hamilton had successfully completed his investigation and presented findings to the government, Orlov stood to lose billions and potentially face criminal charges. He decided to eliminate the problem by eliminating Hamilton. The plan was sophisticated because it had to be. You cannot just shoot someone inside Buckingham Palace. You need a delivery mechanism that bypasses security. A compromised diplomat with legitimate access was the perfect solution. James felt a cold anger building. So all of this, kidnapping Rebecca, threatening Montague, trying to kill Hamilton, was about protecting illegal money. Torres nodded grimly. Welcome to the world of high-level crime. People like Orlov do not see human lives as valuable. They see them as obstacles or tools. Rebecca Montague was a tool to control her father. Hamilton was an obstacle to be removed. You were an unexpected variable that disrupted the plan. Orlov is currently in Moscow, beyond our immediate reach, but we are working with international partners to bring charges and pursue extradition. It will be a long process, but we will get him eventually. The knowledge that the person behind the assassination attempt had been identified brought James some relief. But it also raised new questions. If Orlov is in Russia and his operatives are being arrested, does that mean the threat to me is reduced? Ashford's expression was cautious. Reduced, yes. Eliminated? No. Orlov has resources and reach. Until we can confirm that he has given up on any plans targeting you or using you as leverage, we need to maintain protective measures. However, we are discussing transitioning you from full protective custody to enhanced security. Protocols that would allow you to return to a more normal life. Give us another week to complete arrests and assess the remaining threat level. That week felt longer than all the previous days combined. James was restless, desperate to return to some kind of normalcy, to see his family, to return to his duties. He exercised obsessively in the flat's small gym, read every book David and Marcus could bring him, and watched more television than he had in his entire adult life. Finally, 15 days after the incident at the North Gate, Ashford arrived in person to deliver the news James had been waiting for. Corporal Aldridge, we believe the immediate threat has been sufficiently neutralized. You will be returning to active duty at the palace, though with enhanced security awareness and some modifications to your assignment. James returned to Buckingham Palace on a grey Monday morning 3 weeks after the incident that had changed his life. The building looked exactly the same, its grand facade unchanged. Tourists still gathering at the gates with cameras and excited chatter. But for James, everything felt different. He was no longer the anonymous guard standing at attention, invisible behind the uniform and ceremony. He was now the man who had stopped an assassination, the soldier whose instincts had saved a life and prevented an international crisis. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders as he walked through the staff entrance, nodding to colleagues who looked at him with new expressions. Some showed respect, others curiosity, a few what might have been resentment or jealousy. Captain Morrison met him in the security briefing room, her manner professional but warmer than it had been before the incident. She explained his new assignment with careful detail. James would no longer be stationed at the gates. Instead, he was being moved to the palace's close protection unit. a specialized team responsible for personal security of senior royal household members. It was a promotion in everything but official title, a recognition of his abilities and judgment. The work would be more varied, more demanding, and significantly more dangerous. James would need additional training in threat assessment, defensive driving, emergency medical response, and advanced weapons handling. He would be working in plain clothes more often, blending into the background while maintaining constant vigilance. The training began immediately and consumed the next 6 weeks of his life. James had thought his previous military and guard training had been thorough, but the close protection course was on an entirely different level. He learned to read environments with paranoid attention to detail, identifying exit routes and potential threats in seconds. He practiced defensive driving techniques, learning to navigate vehicles through hostile situations at high speeds. He studied human behavior and body language with psychologists, who taught him to spot deception and aggression before they became physical threats. He trained in hand-to-hand combat with instructors who pushed him to his absolute limits, teaching techniques designed, not for sport but for real survival situations. The work was exhausting and sometimes humiliating. James made mistakes, misjudged scenarios, failed exercises, but he also discovered capabilities he had not known he possessed. His instincts, the same ones that had triggered his alert about Ambassador Montague, proved consistently reliable. During scenario training, where actors would approach him in various guises, some innocent and some threatening, James correctly identified genuine threats with remarkable accuracy. His instructors noticed and began pushing him harder, giving him more complex scenarios, forcing him to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. By the end of the course, James had developed a reputation as someone with exceptional situational awareness and judgment under pressure. During this period, the broader investigation into the assassination attempt continued to unfold. Viktor Orlov remained in Russia, protected by a government that had no interest in extraditing him to face British justice. However, his financial empire was being systematically dismantled. Hamilton's investigation, which had nearly cost him his life, was completed with renewed urgency and determination. International sanctions froze billions in Orlov's assets. Shell companies were exposed and shut down. Business partners were arrested across multiple countries. Orlov himself appeared on television from Moscow, delivering angry denials and claiming to be the victim of Western political persecution. But the evidence was overwhelming and public opinion had turned decisively against him. The operatives from Volkov Solutions who had been arrested were facing serious charges. 3 had already accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against the organization's leadership. Rebecca Montague had returned to Brussels, traumatized but determined to rebuild her life. Her father remained in custody, his future uncertain. The legal complexities of his situation were immense. He had attempted to commit murder, carrying a lethal weapon into a secure location with intent to use it, but he had done so under extreme duress, believing his daughter would be killed if he refused. Prosecutors and defense attorneys were negotiating, trying to find an outcome that acknowledged both the seriousness of his actions and the terrible circumstances that had compelled them. Public opinion was divided, some seeing him as a would-be assassin who deserved harsh punishment, others as a desperate father who had been victimized by ruthless criminals. James followed these developments through classified briefings and occasional news reports. He felt a complicated mix of emotions about Montague. The man had tried to murder someone, had carried a lethal weapon with the intention of using it, but James could not bring himself to hate him. Montague had been trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between his daughter's life and his duty. What would James have done in that position? He wanted to believe he would have contacted authorities, trusted the system to protect his family. But he also knew that when someone you love is in danger, rational decision-making becomes nearly impossible. Fear and desperation can make people do things they would never otherwise consider. His first assignment, after completing the training course, was to provide security for Sir Geoffrey Hamilton during a diplomatic trip to France. James met Hamilton for the first time in a palace office, a spacious room filled with antique furniture and portraits of long-dead royals. Hamilton was in his mid-60s, tall and distinguished with silver hair and intelligent eyes. He stood when James entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. James shook it, feeling oddly nervous. This was the man whose life he had saved, though they had never spoken about it directly. Hamilton gestured for James to sit, pouring tea from a porcelain pot without asking if James wanted any. It was the kind of casual assumption of hospitality that came from a lifetime in aristocratic circles. Hamilton settled into his chair and studied James with frank curiosity. He spoke with the refined accent of someone educated at the finest schools, his words measured and precise. He thanked James directly for what he had done at the North Gate, acknowledging that he owed his life to James's instincts and courage. He did not dramatize it or become emotional, simply stated it as a fact. James felt embarrassed and mumbled something about just doing his duty. Hamilton smiled at that, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. He said that duty was often invoked to diminish extraordinary actions, to make heroism seem routine. But what James had done was not routine. He had trusted his judgment over established procedures, taken personal risk to prevent a threat that no one else had recognized, that required not just training but character. They discussed the upcoming trip to France, Hamilton explaining the diplomatic purposes and potential security concerns. There would be meetings with French government officials, a reception at the British Embassy, attendance at a cultural event. James would be part of a 4-person protection team, responsible for close security, while Hamilton moved through various venues. The threat level was considered moderate. Orlov was neutralized financially but still had resources and motivation for revenge. Volkov's solutions had been damaged but not destroyed. There was always the possibility of extremist groups or lone actors targeting British officials. James would need to maintain constant awareness without being obvious about it, providing security while allowing Hamilton to do his job and maintain diplomatic relationships. The trip itself was James's first real test in his new role. Paris in autumn was beautiful, the city gleaming under crisp blue skies, but James barely noticed the scenery. His attention was on people, patterns, anything that seemed out of place or potentially threatening. He watched faces in crowds, noted vehicles that appeared multiple times, tracked exits and potential danger points. The other members of the protection team were experienced professionals who had been doing this work for years. They moved with practiced efficiency, communicating through subtle gestures and concealed earpieces, coordinating movements to ensure Hamilton was always surrounded by layers of security. During a reception at the British Embassy, James spotted something that triggered his alert instincts. A waiter was moving through the crowd with a tray of champagne glasses. Nothing unusual about that, but his movement pattern was wrong. Professional waiters circulate in predictable ways, offering drinks sufficiently to groups of guests. This man was moving with purpose toward Hamilton, his attention fixed on the target rather than on the guests he was ostensibly serving. James moved smoothly to intercept, positioning himself between the waiter and Hamilton. The waiter noticed and altered course, heading instead toward the kitchen. James followed at a discreet distance, speaking quietly into his communication device to alert the rest of the team. In the kitchen, the waiter was questioned by French security personnel who had been coordinating with the British protection team. His credentials were checked and verified as legitimate. His background showed nothing suspicious. He claimed he had simply been bringing fresh champagne to that area of the reception. But when pressed about his movement pattern, his story became less consistent. Eventually, under sustained questioning, he admitted that he had been offered money by someone to get close to Hamilton and take photographs with a hidden camera. He was not part of any assassination plot, just an opportunist willing to sell access and information. French police arrested him for industrial espionage and breach of security protocols. James's teammates congratulated him on the catch. Impressed by his observation skills, Hamilton thanked James privately after the incident. Acknowledging that it must be exhausting to maintain such constant vigilance, James admitted that it was demanding but also strangely satisfying. There was purpose in this work, meaning in knowing that his attention and judgment could prevent harm. Hamilton nodded thoughtfully and shared something of his own experience. He said that he had worked in the royal household for nearly 40 years, dedicating his life to service and duty. He had always known intellectually that his position carried risks, that people in power attracted threats, but the assassination attempt had made it visceral and personal in a way he had not fully anticipated. For weeks after learning about it, he had struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance, jumping at unexpected sounds, questioning the intentions of people he had worked with for years. He had sought counseling, something he would not have considered before, viewing it as weakness or self-indulgence. But talking with a professional had helped him process the trauma and develop strategies for managing the fear. He shared this with James because he wanted James to understand that recognizing emotional impacts was not weakness, but wisdom. James had not just prevented an assassination that day at the North Gate. He had lived through a traumatic event himself, made life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure, then been thrown into protective custody and investigation. Those experiences left marks. If James ever needed to talk with someone, resources were available and using them would be a sign of strength, not weakness. James appreciated Hamilton's candor more than he could express. He had been struggling with exactly the issues Hamilton described, though he had not wanted to admit it even to himself. The hypervigilance that made him good at his job also made it hard to relax. He found himself assessing threats in off-duty situations, unable to simply enjoy a meal at a restaurant without noting exits and potential weapons. His sleep was often disrupted by dreams of things going wrong, scenarios where he missed a threat and someone died because of his failure. He had not told anyone about this, worried that admitting psychological strain might get him removed from the job he had worked so hard to earn. Hamilton's openness gave James permission to acknowledge his own struggles. He began meeting with one of the palace's counselors, a quiet woman named Dr. Patricia Collins, who specialized in helping security personnel manage the psychological demands of their work. She helped James understand that what he was experiencing was normal, that his brain was simply trying to process extraordinary events and prepare for future threats. She taught him techniques for managing anxiety, for separating on-duty vigilance from off-duty relaxation, for recognizing when his threat assessment was appropriate versus when it was excessive. The work was difficult and sometimes uncomfortable, forcing James to confront vulnerabilities he would rather have ignored. But gradually he began to feel more balanced, more able to exist in the world without constant defensive tension. 6 months after the incident at the North Gate, James had settled into his new role with a confidence that felt earned rather than assumed. He had completed multiple protection assignments, traveling with various members of the royal household to diplomatic events across Europe and beyond. Each assignment brought new challenges and learning opportunities. He had protected officials during tense negotiations in Brussels, provided security at cultural events in Berlin, and maintained vigilance during trade discussions in Singapore. His reputation within the protection unit had grown steadily. Colleagues respected his judgment and trusted his instincts. Supervisors noted his performance evaluations with consistent praise for his awareness, professionalism, and ability to remain calm under pressure. But the work was taking its toll in ways that were not immediately obvious. James had little personal life outside his duties. His days off were spent recovering from the exhaustion of constant vigilance, sleeping late, and avoiding social situations that required engagement. He had dated briefly, meeting a woman named Claire at a coffee shop near his apartment. She was a primary school teacher, warm and funny, and interested in getting to know him. But the relationship had faltered quickly. James could not talk about his work in any meaningful way. Security protocols prevented him from sharing details about his assignments or the people he protected. When Claire asked about his day, he gave vague responses that left conversations feeling hollow and disconnected. She grew frustrated with his evasiveness, interpreting it as emotional unavailability rather than professional necessity. After 6 weeks, she ended things gently, saying she needed someone who could actually be present in the relationship. James had not tried dating again after that. It felt pointless to pursue relationships that were structurally doomed by the requirements of his job. His family worried about him during their occasional phone calls. His mother asked repeatedly when he would visit Cornwall, expressing concern that he sounded tired and distant. His sister Emily sent frequent text messages trying to maintain connection, sharing photos of her students and stories from her teaching. James appreciated their efforts but found it increasingly difficult to engage. His world had narrowed to work and recovery from work, a cycle that left little room for anything else. The case against Ambassador Philip Montagu had finally reached its conclusion in the courts. After extensive legal proceedings and negotiations, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The judge acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of his coercion, the fact that his daughter's life had been genuinely threatened, and his immediate cooperation with authorities after the arrest, but the severity of his intended crime, bringing a lethal weapon into the palace with intent to commit murder, required significant punishment. The sentence was seen as a compromise. Harsh enough to acknowledge the seriousness of his actions, but lenient enough to recognize his victimization. Public reaction was mixed, with some viewing it as too harsh, and others as too lenient. Montagu himself accepted the sentence without appeal, stating in a brief court appearance that he took full responsibility for his choices and hoped his punishment would bring some closure to everyone affected. Rebecca Montagu had testified during the proceedings, describing her kidnapping and captivity in devastating detail. Her testimony had been difficult to hear, her voice breaking multiple times as she recounted the fear and helplessness of those days. She spoke about her father with obvious love and pain, acknowledging that he had made a terrible choice, but understanding why he had made it. After the trial, she gave a single interview to a major newspaper, speaking about forgiveness and the complexity of moral judgment. She said that she had been angry with her father initially, horrified that he had been willing to kill someone to save her. But over time, she had come to see him as another victim of Viktor Orlov's cruelty. Her father had not created the impossible situation. He had simply been trapped in it and made the choice that his love for her demanded. She was working to rebuild her relationship with him through prison visits and letters, trying to find a path forward through the trauma that had consumed both their lives. James followed these developments with complicated feelings. He understood Rebecca's perspective and sympathized with her father's impossible position, but he also could not forget that Montagu had been minutes away from murdering Sir Geoffrey Hamilton. Intent mattered. Actions had consequences. The legal system had to balance compassion with accountability. James did not know if the sentence was right or wrong. He only knew that everyone involved had been damaged by events that originated with one man's greed and willingness to use violence to protect his interests. Viktor Orlov remained free in Russia, insulated from consequences by political connections and geographical distance. That injustice gnawed at James more than he wanted to admit. Spring arrived with sudden warmth, London's parks exploding into bloom almost overnight. James was assigned to accompany Sir Geoffrey Hamilton on a week-long trip to Scotland for meetings with government officials about economic development initiatives in the Highlands. The assignment felt routine, low threat level, more about diplomatic protocol than genuine security concerns. The protection team consisted of James and 2 other officers, all of them experienced and comfortable working together. They traveled by train to Edinburgh, Hamilton preferring the scenic journey over flying. During the trip, Hamilton invited James to join him in the dining car for lunch, a gesture that surprised James. Their relationship had remained professional but distant, defined by clear hierarchies and roles. Over sandwiches and coffee, Hamilton asked James about his life outside work. The question was casual but genuine, an actual interest rather than polite small talk. James found himself being more honest than he had intended. He admitted that he did not have much of a life outside work, that the demands of the job had consumed most of his time and energy. Hamilton listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, his expression thoughtful. When James finished, Hamilton shared something of his own experience. He said that he had sacrificed much for his career over the decades. 2 marriages had failed, unable to withstand the demands of his position and his commitment to duty above personal relationships. His children, now adults, had grown up largely without him, raised primarily by their mothers while he pursued diplomatic advancement and royal service. He spoke about the regrets that came with aging, the realization that professional achievements, however significant, could not substitute for human connection and personal fulfillment. He had been successful by every measurable standard. He had advised monarchs, influenced policy, represented his country with distinction, but he often felt lonely and wondered if the sacrifices had been worth it. He was not telling James to leave his job or stop caring about his duties, but he wanted James to understand that balance was not weakness or lack of commitment. It was survival. The work would consume everything James was willing to give it. Learning to set boundaries and preserve parts of himself for other aspects of life was essential for long-term well-being. James appreciated the advice but struggled to see how to implement it. His job required availability and flexibility that made traditional relationships and hobbies difficult. He could not commit to regular social plans when assignments might require sudden travel. He could not discuss his work with friends who did not have security clearances. He could not relax fully when his trained instincts were constantly scanning for threats, even in supposedly safe environments. Hamilton acknowledged these challenges, but suggested that difficulty was not the same as impossibility. Many people in security and military careers managed to maintain personal lives. It required intention and effort, but it could be done. James might need to be creative, to find activities and relationships that accommodated his constraints rather than assuming nothing was possible. The Scotland trip itself was uneventful from a security perspective, which James appreciated after months of high-tension assignments. They attended meetings in government buildings, stayed in a comfortable hotel with adequate security, and had time for a few tourist activities that Hamilton insisted on including. James found himself actually enjoying parts of the trip, particularly a visit to Edinburgh Castle, where Hamilton gave an impromptu history lesson about Scottish independence movements and their influence on constitutional development. Hamilton was passionate about history, his knowledge detailed and his storytelling engaging. James realized he had been viewing Hamilton primarily as a protection assignment, a body to keep safe, rather than as a complex person with interests in depth. During their final evening in Edinburgh, the protection team relaxed in the hotel bar after Hamilton had retired to his room for the night. James's colleagues, both veterans of close protection work, shared stories from their careers and offered advice about managing the peculiar stresses of their profession. Marcus, a former Special Forces operator with 15 years of protection experience, talked about the importance of having release valves, activities completely separate from work, that allowed mental decompression. For him, it was rock climbing. The physical challenge and mental focus required providing an outlet that felt worlds away from security concerns. Sarah, who had transferred to Royal Protection after years with diplomatic security services, emphasized the value of therapy and professional mental health support. She had been resistant initially, viewing it as unnecessary or a sign of weakness, but regular counseling had helped her manage anxiety and maintain perspective during particularly stressful periods. They asked James about his coping strategies, and he had to admit he did not really have any beyond sleeping and occasionally going to the gym. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances that suggested this was a familiar pattern among newer protection officers. They gently but firmly encouraged James to develop better self-care practices. The job was demanding, and would remain demanding. Without active strategies for managing stress and maintaining mental health, burnout was inevitable. They had seen talented officers flame out, becoming unable to function effectively because they had given everything to the work and left nothing for themselves. James did not want to become one of those cautionary tales. He needed to invest in his own well-being with the same dedication he brought to his professional duties. James returned to London from Scotland, with a new determination to create more balance in his life. He started small, committing to regular exercise beyond sporadic gym visits. He joined a martial arts studio that offered evening classes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The training was physically demanding and mentally engaging, requiring complete focus that left no room for work-related thoughts. The instructor and other students knew nothing about his job beyond vague references to security work. In that space, James was just another person learning techniques and testing himself against skilled opponents. The physicality of grappling provided a release for accumulated tension, and the progressive skill development gave him goals unrelated to his career. He also began meeting regularly with Dr. Collins for ongoing counseling rather than just crisis intervention. They worked on strategies for compartmentalizing work stress, for recognizing when his hypervigilance was appropriate versus excessive, for maintaining connections with family despite the constraints of his schedule. Dr. Collins helped James understand that his tendency to withdraw from relationships was a protective mechanism, a way of avoiding vulnerability in a life that required constant defensive readiness. But that protection came at a cost, isolating him from the very connections that might sustain him through difficult periods. Learning to be selectively vulnerable, to trust certain people with parts of himself, while maintaining professional boundaries, was a skill he could develop. Reconnecting with his family became a priority. James scheduled a visit to Cornwall to see his parents, something he had been postponing for months. The visit was initially awkward, his parents clearly worried about him but unsure how to express their concerns without seeming intrusive. James had spent so long maintaining emotional distance that opening up felt strange and uncomfortable. But over the course of a long weekend, old patterns reasserted themselves. He helped his father with repairs around their cottage, falling into the comfortable rhythm of working together. He had long conversations with his mother over tea, sharing more about his life than he had in years. He could not tell them details about his work, but he could talk about the psychological challenges of the job, his efforts to maintain balance, his appreciation for their support even when he had not been good at showing it. His sister Emily visited during his stay, bringing her new boyfriend and filling the cottage with laughter and energy. James found himself genuinely enjoying their company, asking questions about her teaching and listening to stories about her students with real interest rather than polite obligation. Emily pulled him aside at one point and told him she was relieved to see him seeming more like himself. She admitted that she had been worried, that his calls and messages over the past year had felt hollow and disconnected. She understood his job was demanding and confidential, but she needed to know he was okay beyond professional success. James assured her he was working on it, that he was learning to be more than just his job. The most significant development came unexpectedly several weeks after returning from Cornwall. James was off duty, attending his jiu-jitsu class, when he was paired with a new student for sparring. Her name was Dr. Amelia Chen, a trauma surgeon at a major London hospital who had taken up martial arts as a way to manage stress from her own demanding career. They rolled together, testing techniques and defenses, and James was impressed by her quick learning and fearless approach. After class, they ended up talking, comparing notes about high-pressure professions that required constant vigilance and split-second decision-making. Amelia understood pressure and responsibility in ways most people did not. Her work involved life-and-death decisions, managing emergencies, maintaining composure when everything was chaos. They began meeting for coffee after classes, conversations extending from martial arts to broader topics about managing demanding careers, finding meaning in difficult work, and maintaining humanity in professions that required emotional compartmentalization. Amelia did not ask intrusive questions about James's specific job, respecting the boundaries he indicated while still engaging with the general challenges he faced. James found himself looking forward to their conversations, appreciating the connection with someone who understood his world without needing detailed explanations. When Amelia suggested they have dinner sometime outside the martial arts context, James agreed without the hesitation that had characterized his previous attempts at dating. The relationship with Amelia developed slowly, both of them cautious about commitment given their demanding careers. They had dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant where the lighting was dim and the atmosphere relaxed. Conversation flowed easily, moving from surface topics to deeper discussions about purpose and meaning. Amelia talked about why she had chosen trauma surgery, her desire to intervene at moments of crisis when skilled action could mean the difference between life and death. James recognized the parallel to his own motivations, the need to serve at critical junctures where his training and judgment mattered most. They both understood living with the weight of responsibility, knowing that mistakes or inattention could have catastrophic consequences. What made the relationship different from James's previous attempts at dating was Amelia's genuine understanding of professional demands. When James had to cancel plans because of a sudden assignment, she did not take it personally or complain about his unreliability. Her own schedule was equally unpredictable. Shifts extending when emergencies arrived, plans abandoned when patients needed her skills. They learned to communicate flexibly, making time when both were available rather than expecting conventional relationship patterns. Their dates were sometimes at odd hours, meeting for breakfast after her night shift, or late dinners after his protection duties ended. The unconventional timing felt natural rather than frustrating, because both understood the reality of their lives. James found himself sharing more with Amelia than he had with anyone outside his counseling sessions. He could not tell her operational details or specific assignments, but he could talk about the psychological challenges of constant vigilance, the difficulty of maintaining human connection while staying professionally guarded, the satisfaction of work that mattered mixed with the exhaustion it demanded. Amelia shared her own struggles with similar issues, the emotional toll of watching patients die despite her best efforts, the necessity of maintaining clinical detachment while still caring deeply about outcomes, the challenge of leaving work mentally when shifts ended. But knowing emergencies were always happening, their relationship provided James with something he had not realized he was missing, a sense of being understood without needing to explain everything. Amelia knew the shape of his life even without knowing its details. She respected his boundaries while still being present and supportive. They developed rituals that fit their constraints, meeting at the martial arts studio twice weekly, having dinner afterward when possible, texting throughout days when they could not see each other. The relationship was not conventional or easy, but it felt sustainable in ways his previous attempts had not. 9 months after the assassination attempt that had changed his life, James received unexpected news from Deputy Director Ashford. Viktor Orlov had been found dead in his Moscow apartment, apparently from a heart attack. Though Russian authorities were not allowing independent investigation, the circumstances were suspicious enough that Western intelligence services suspected assassination rather than natural causes. Orlov had made many enemies beyond the British government, his criminal activities and betrayals creating a long list of people with motives to kill him. Whether his death was natural, ordered by the Russian government to eliminate a liability, or revenge from business partners he had betrayed, the result was the same. The man who had orchestrated the attempt on Hamilton's life was gone. James felt a strange emptiness at the news rather than satisfaction or closure. Orlov's death did not undo the trauma Rebecca Montague had experienced or return the years her father would spend in prison. It did not erase the fear James had felt or the life disruptions that had followed. Justice, if this even counted as justice, felt hollow and incomplete. Ashford seemed to understand James's mixed reaction during their briefing. He acknowledged that closure was rarely as satisfying as people hoped it would be. Events left scars that persisted regardless of how neatly investigations concluded or how thoroughly perpetrators were punished. The best anyone could do was learn from experiences, integrate them into understanding of the world, and continue moving forward. The palace held a private ceremony several weeks later to formally recognize James's actions on that September morning. It was a small gathering, attended only by senior security personnel, key royal household officials, and Sir Geoffrey Hamilton. James received a commendation for exceptional service and judgment, along with a formal promotion to sergeant within the protection unit. The recognition was meaningful but also slightly uncomfortable. James had not stopped Montague seeking glory or recognition. He had simply trusted his instincts and followed his training. Being celebrated for it felt strange, as if the ceremony was for someone else rather than for him. Hamilton spoke briefly during the ceremony, his words characteristically thoughtful and precise. He thanked James directly for saving his life, acknowledging the debt that could never be fully repaid. But he also spoke more broadly about the nature of duty and service. He said that societies depended on individuals willing to stand between order and chaos, to make difficult decisions with incomplete information, to trust their judgment when easier paths would be to defer or ignore. James represented the best of what service meant, not blind obedience to protocol but thoughtful engagement with responsibility. Hamilton hoped the recognition would serve as a reminder to everyone present that rules and procedures were tools to support judgment, not substitutes for it. After the ceremony, James's parents and sister attended a small reception. It was the first time they had been inside Buckingham Palace, and Emily could barely contain her excitement, whispering questions about the artwork and furnishings. James's mother hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes, telling him how proud she was. His father, typically reserved and understated, simply gripped his shoulder and nodded, the gesture communicating more than words could. Having them present transformed the ceremony from a professional obligation into something personally meaningful. They represented the life outside work that James had been learning to maintain, the connections that grounded him and reminded him why his service mattered. Amelia attended as well, having traded shifts with a colleague to be present. She stood slightly apart from his family, respecting boundaries but clearly there to support him. James introduced her to his parents and Emily, feeling nervous about their reactions. But his mother immediately embraced her, thanking her for taking care of James. Emily pulled Amelia aside for animated conversation, undoubtedly asking intrusive questions that James would hear about later. His father shook her hand with his characteristic formality but with warmth in his eyes. Watching his family accept Amelia felt significant, as if different parts of his life were finally integrating rather than existing in separate compartments. The months that followed settled into a sustainable rhythm. James continued his protection work, traveling with various royal household members and maintaining vigilance against potential threats. But he also protected time for other aspects of his life with new intent. He visited Cornwall regularly, maintaining connections with his parents. He continued his martial arts training, progressing in skill and finding community among the students at the studio. His relationship with Amelia deepened, moving from cautious exploration to committed partnership. They moved in together after a year, finding an apartment that accommodated both their schedules and need for quiet recovery. Time after demanding work periods, the work itself evolved as James gained experience and seniority. He began training newer protection officers, teaching them the skills and judgment he had developed through his own progression. He found satisfaction in mentoring, helping others navigate the challenges of the profession while avoiding the pitfalls he had experienced. His teaching emphasized the importance of trusting instincts while also maintaining balance and self-care. He shared his own story about stopping Ambassador Montague, using it to illustrate how pattern recognition and behavioral assessment could identify threats that formal protocols missed. But he also talked about the aftermath, the psychological impact of high-stress events, the necessity of seeking support rather than trying to handle everything alone. James maintained contact with Sir Geoffrey Hamilton, their relationship evolving from strictly professional to something resembling friendship. They had lunch occasionally when both were in London, conversations ranging from security matters to history to personal philosophy. Hamilton became a mentor of sorts, someone whose experience and wisdom James valued. Hamilton had finally retired from his position as the King's private secretary after decades of service. Stepping back to enjoy personal pursuits he had neglected during his career, he spoke often about the importance of knowing when to transition, of recognizing that even deeply meaningful work had natural endpoints that should be honored rather than resisted. 2 years after the assassination attempt, James received notification that Ambassador Philip Montague was being released on parole after serving 3 years of his sentence. The news brought back memories of that morning at the North Gate, the trembling hands and nervous gestures that had triggered James's alert. He wondered how Montague was doing, whether prison had broken him, or whether he had found some way to survive the experience. Several weeks later, James received a letter, forwarded through official channels after security screening. It was from Montague, written in careful handwriting on plain paper. The letter was brief but deeply personal. Montague thanked James for stopping him that morning, acknowledging that James had not only saved Hamilton's life but also Montague's soul. In the terrible moment when he had been preparing to commit murder, Montague had felt himself becoming something monstrous, someone he did not recognize. James's intervention had prevented him from crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Prison had been difficult but also clarifying. Time to reflect on choices and consequences, to understand how fear and love had been manipulated into weapons against him. He was rebuilding his relationship with his daughter, working to earn her forgiveness and trust. He did not expect James to forgive him, or even respond to the letter. He simply wanted James to know that what had seemed like a confrontation that morning had actually been a rescue, saving multiple people from tragedy. James read the letter several times, processing complicated emotions. He had never considered that stopping Montague might have benefited Montague himself. That prevention of the assassination was not just about protecting Hamilton, but also about protecting Montague from becoming a murderer. The perspective shift was profound. His action that morning had created a branch point where multiple lives diverged from terrible outcomes toward possibilities of healing and growth. He did not respond to the letter immediately, needing time to consider what, if anything, he wanted to say. Eventually, he sent a brief note through the same official channels, wishing Montague well in rebuilding his life and hoping he found peace. Rebecca Montague also reached out, requesting a meeting through formal channels. James agreed, curious about what she wanted to discuss. They met at a quiet cafe in central London, Rebecca arriving precisely on time and greeting him with nervous formality. She thanked him for meeting her, acknowledging that the request was unusual. She looked healthy, though James could see traces of strain around her eyes, the kind of weariness that came from carrying trauma. She explained that she had been working with therapists to process her kidnapping and its aftermath, part of which involved understanding all the people whose actions had affected her situation. James was one of those people, the guard whose instincts had disrupted the terrible chain of events. Rebecca said she needed James to understand something important. She had been angry at him initially, learning that the guard who stopped her father was being celebrated as a hero while her father went to prison. It had felt unjust and cruel, but over time, through therapy and reflection, she had come to see the situation differently. James had not created the impossible situation her family faced. He had simply been doing his job, protecting people, trusting his training. His actions had stopped a murder and prevented her father from becoming something he never could have lived with being. She wanted James to know she was grateful, even though gratitude felt complicated and painful. She also wanted to apologize for any resentment she had felt toward him, recognizing it had been misdirected anger at circumstances beyond anyone's control. James listened to Rebecca with growing understanding and compassion. He told her she did not need to apologize for her feelings, that anger and resentment in the face of trauma were natural and valid. He expressed his own complicated feelings about her father, recognizing the impossible situation Montague had faced while also acknowledging the seriousness of what had almost happened. They talked for over an hour, two people whose lives had been connected by terrible circumstances, trying to make sense of experiences that defied easy interpretation. When they parted, Rebecca hugged him briefly, surprising them both. She said she hoped he was taking care of himself, that heroes and stories never dealt with the aftermath, but real people did and deserved support. The encounter with Rebecca stayed with James for weeks, reshaping his understanding of that September morning. He had focused primarily on the immediate security implications, the threat prevented, the protocol questions raised, but the human dimensions were equally important, perhaps more so. Multiple lives had been irrevocably changed by events that morning, trajectories altered, relationships damaged, and slowly rebuilt, trauma inflicted and gradually processed. His role had been significant but also part of a much larger story, involving many people making difficult choices under terrible circumstances. 5 years after the assassination attempt, James proposed to Amelia during a quiet weekend at a cottage in the Lake District. She said yes immediately, laughing and crying simultaneously. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony attended by family and close friends. Sir Geoffrey Hamilton attended, along with several of James's colleagues from the protection unit. Captain Morrison, now promoted to Deputy Director of Palace Security, gave a toast, celebrating James's service and his wisdom in building a life beyond the job. James's parents beamed throughout the ceremony, his mother crying happily while his father maintained his characteristic stoic approval. Emily served as a bridesmaid, organizing details with enthusiastic efficiency. The marriage marked a new chapter, one where James felt genuinely balanced between professional duty and personal fulfillment. He continued his protection work but with clearer boundaries and better self-care practices. Amelia continued her trauma surgery, both of them understanding and supporting the demands of each other's careers. They talked about having children eventually, aware that it would complicate their already complicated lives but wanting to build a family together. They bought a small house with a garden, creating a space that felt like home rather than just a place to recover between assignments. James sometimes reflected on that morning at the North Gate, the moment his instincts had triggered an alert that changed multiple lives. He had been 28 years old, 6 years into military service, doing a job that had become routine. Nothing about that morning had seemed special or significant, until Ambassador Montague approached with trembling hands and nervous gestures. The decision to stop him, to trust instinct over protocol, to risk professional consequences for the sake of preventing something wrong, had been made in seconds, but its effects had rippled outward through years. Lives saved, lives changed, careers altered, relationships formed and broken and rebuilt. The experience had taught James that vigilance was not just about watching for threats, but about trusting judgment, even when it contradicted convenience or protocol. It had taught him that preventing tragedy created its own complications, that there were no simple heroes or villains, only people making difficult choices with incomplete information under immense pressure. It had taught him that service mattered but could not be everything, that balance and connection were not luxuries but necessities for sustainable engagement with difficult work. Most importantly, it had taught him that the moments that define lives are often unexpected, arriving without warning during routine duties on ordinary mornings, requiring presence and courage to recognize and act upon them when they come.